Yeah, thank you everyone for joining today. I think we'll go ahead and get started as probably a few more people trickle in. So today, we actually have a lot of things on the agenda. Wanted to give a quick recap of the vulnerability that was discovered in the 2.0 contracts about a month ago now, and how we're thinking about our programming going forward and also risk management as users of the protocol. Want to give a recap of the recent governance votes that have just passed, some 3.0 updates, and then we want to cover some updates with our tooling, as well as answer any questions. So on July 12th, we were made aware of a exploit in the 0x 2.0 contracts. Somebody was looking through our code base that was linked to in our bug bounty program, and they discovered this. So we wrote a blog post, actually a few blog posts kind of detailing what happened after this was discovered. So I won't get too into the weeds, but it was a very bad vulnerability, pretty much as bad as it could have gotten. And we shut down the existing exchange contract and we redeployed all the smart contracts. The reason we chose to redeploy everything was to avoid having to wait 2 weeks for the time lock to be up before we could swap out the existing exchange contract with a new exchange contract. So overall, the smart contracts were down for, I believe, about 4 hours. And thankfully, everyone was pretty quick to respond and point to the new smart contract addresses. So thank you all for being on top of it and making that upgrade. You know, this happened on a Friday night, basically. So I know we were definitely working through the weekend, and I'm sure a lot of you were too. So thank you for coming together and taking care of that so quickly. So what are we doing about security going forward? I would say primarily we are going to be reducing our usage of assembly going forward. There were some areas in our code base where we had to use assembly just because those functions didn't exist in Solidity. Currently, Solidity has a lot more functionality than it did at the time the 2.0 contracts were written, so I think we'll need to use less assembly for those types of reasons. There were also other areas where we are using assembly strictly for optimizing the code. I think the risk reward of that is probably not worth it. You know, smart contracts are getting more and more complicated across the board, and in addition to that, they're, you know, more frequently interacting with each other. So even small bugs, I feel like, can bubble up and cause larger problems. So optimization is less of an issue, and security is probably the most important thing that needs to be considered when writing smart contracts. In addition to that, we are going to be looking more closely at the developments in Solidity itself. And I think every now and then we'll be, you know, reviewing the changes and, you know, potentially even looking at the implementation of some of these changes, just to make sure that there are no security vulnerabilities within the Solidity language itself. We're also going to be very heavily focused on testing and implementing some pretty advanced testing frameworks. I'll cover a little bit of that in the next slide. And we'll also be exploring formal verification of the 0x smart contracts. So what have we done so far? So we took about a week to do an internal audit of the deployed 2.1 smart contracts, and we did not find any vulnerabilities, although we we did find some potential areas for improvement that will be making it into 3.0. We also took a step back and have just been focused purely on improving our testing infrastructure for about a month. And we're still continued to only focus on that. We basically put a pause on the 3.0 smart contracts themselves, aside from some smaller changes, just to focus on testing. We're also working with our smart contract auditors to use some more advanced tooling around testing, including static analysis tooling, and then probably more importantly, fuzz testing. So fuzz testing kind of generates like random combinations of random inputs to test certain properties of the smart contracts. And I think a good litmus test to see if this would be valuable for us is if we could have caught the 2.0 vulnerability by using this methodology. And yes, so as I mentioned, I think the V3 timeline will be pushed back roughly a month because we are basically focused on improving our testing infrastructure at the moment. I'll get into better timelines in a few slides. So we also had a question from Rego Block, and I decided to address it here because I think it goes along pretty nicely with the vulnerability itself. So the question was around mitigating risks as an end user. So by default for ERC20 tokens, people tend to set their allowance to unlimited. So if there are vulnerabilities, that means that your entire balance could potentially be drained. You know, we use unlimited allowances for the sake of user experience because you don't have to then reset your allowances multiple times. And then there are also some gas efficiency reasons for doing so. People typically use unlimited allowances. I think this is something that can potentially be reevaluated going forward. But at the same time, a lot of the newer token standards only support unlimited allowances. So I'm not sure that we're fully addressing the problem by capping allowances at some amount. But I think what you could do, especially if you are trading programmatically on the protocol, you could certainly consider dynamic allowances or segregating balances between accounts, some of which may have an allowance and some of which may not have an allowance. So these are things that we have heard from speaking with some of the more frequent market makers on the protocol. I think this is probably pretty good practice. If you're just more casually interacting with the protocol, I think that's something you need to kind of weigh for yourself. In the same question, Gab asked if some of these limits could potentially be set using smart contract wallets or proxies. I think that's a potential long-term solution, but it seems a bit early for that given the lack of adoption of smart contract wallets, I would say. Again, something to consider. I think this is totally dependent on user preference. So quick update on the recent ZEIP votes. So both ZEIP 24 and 39 were accepted, and these changes should be live on mainnet in about 10 days. They are also all currently deployed to the testnets, and I believe these are also integrated into some of our tooling. So if you want to play around with them, feel free. I also wanted to just take this opportunity to see if anyone had any feedback on the voting process itself. I think the raw amount of ZRX that was used in this vote was larger than the first vote, but the amount of actual voters was definitely smaller. So I think there are a couple issues that are fairly easy. So for the version 3 vote, I would like to at least support all the signature types supported within the 0x exchange contract. So this would allow you to vote from like a multi-sig, for example. But I'm curious if anyone else has any feedback on this.
You got mine. I was going to ask about the multi-sig contracts, but you already got that.
Cool. Yeah, I feel like that could be a big one, and that's something that we definitely need for the 3.0 vote. I guess another reason, this is a bit of a conjecture, but I feel like these particular votes were not very controversial, so maybe people felt like there was less of a reason to vote, but I think 3.0 will be pretty interesting. I also want to highlight that both of these proxies were actually rewritten completely in Solidity. So their initial implementations were in assembly. That was, one of the areas where we were just heavily optimizing. They're fairly simple contracts when written in Solidity, though, so I'm actually pretty happy about that. And I think that going forward, this will allow everyone to iterate much more quickly on the proxies. So here is a rough updated timeline for 3.0. So at the beginning of next month, we're targeting launching the exchange and staking contracts on the testnets. And around that same time, these would be sent off for audits. We are working with both Trail of Bits and Consensus Diligence for security audits. And then probably by the end of September, the relevant extension contracts, such as the coordinator and the forwarder, should be updated with 3.0 support, and those could also be deployed to the testnets. And then probably in late October would be the actual 3.0 vote. So these are all, subject to change, but yeah, just wanted to give everyone the latest. So we're going to pick back up on finalizing the smart contracts at the beginning of next week. And there were a few leftover open questions around some of the implementation details, which I wanted to just talk through in this call. So one of them was around the specific implementation of the protocol fees. So for a quick recap, a fee is paid to the protocol for every fill that happens. So every order that's filled or every partial fill, a fee denominated in Ether will be sent to the staking contracts. And these funds are eventually redistributed to the makers who are staking. The fee scales with the gas price of a transaction. So the original thinking was that when someone filled an order, they would just send Ether along with that fill, and that's how the fee would be paid, and this wouldn't change the UX of filling an order normally because you already need to pay gas. But since then, we've realized that with some of these smart contract to smart contract interactions, this is a bit trickier because not all smart contracts that integrate 0x have the capacity to send regular Ether, and they might only be able to use wrapped Ether. So we've decided to support both Ether and wrapped Ether for paying the protocol fees. So the way this would work is the smart contract would detect if Ether was sent along with the transaction. If it was, it would use that. And if not, it would use wrapped Ether. Also, there are cases where you might accidentally send too much Ether. And in that case, the remaining ETH would be refunded. I think that's a fairly easy one. There was also an edge case around using 0x meta transactions. So a meta transaction allows someone else to execute a 0x exchange function on behalf of the taker. So in this case, it might be like a relayer who is paying the gas, but should the relayer be responsible for paying the protocol fee as well, or should that be the taker? So since we're adding support for wrapped ether, it becomes fairly easy to charge the taker the protocol fee rather than the address that's actually submitting the meta transaction. So I think this actually works out a bit more nicely than it did before. There's one caveat here. We need to add an additional gas price field to 0x meta transactions, where the transaction would have to use this gas price or would have to cap out at this gas price. And that's to essentially allow the taker to specify a maximum protocol fee that they are willing to pay. And then finally, there was some debate around what should happen with the match orders function. Should the matcher pay the protocol fee twice, or is there a way that we can detect that it's like a matching relayer and they might only pay the fee once or something like that? Ultimately, we decided that that would be really hard coding in an edge case. It just felt like a very hacky solution. It just feels like there's much lower attack surface if we just treat these as filling two orders and the matcher is the taker, and they would pay the fee for each matched order. Does anyone have any questions or concerns around any of these points, or is there anywhere that you'd like me to dig deeper?
What about crosses against stable tokens? So a token against a stable token where no wrapped ether is involved. So there's like a third wrapped ether and ETH or ETH are like a.
So you could either pay the fee in regular ether or in wrapped ether. So I think that should cover most of the cases, I would think. As long as you have an allowance set to the ERC20 proxy with your wrapped ether, it should be able to work pretty seamlessly. We've also been considering using a completely separate proxy for the wrapped ether, which would basically require that people specifically approve protocol fees. Sorry, did that answer your question? I'm not sure I fully understood it.
No, I'm basically just thinking about a relayer. It's not really used now, so it's probably not relevant today. Just a relayer that doesn't. A mentioned relayer that lists crosses against a stable token like Circle Dollar. So basically, the user has to set the allowance at the beginning, but maybe then he won't actually have to kind of have much ETH or wrapped ETH on the account.
Yeah, exactly. Or depending what type of matching model that relayer is user, the matching relayer might just need to hold a balance of ether or wrapped ether. Any other questions on this? Cool. So I also wanted to cover some of the upgrades that will be coming to the forwarder contract. There was a pretty new ZEIP posted last week about adding support for ERC 777 in the protocol. So for those who aren't aware, 777 is basically a better version of ERC20, very similar in terms of functionality. But one of the features it does have is it allows you to execute a callback when you transfer a token. So this could potentially be used to fill orders as a taker without actually setting an allowance, which is really nice. But one thing we realized was that we don't actually need to add explicit support for 777 within the protocol because it is completely backwards compatible. So if you're a maker, you could still, approve the ERC20 token or the ERC20 proxy to transfer your 777 token. However, if you're a taker, we can actually add this functionality to the forwarder contract, and you can sell your tokens through the forwarder without setting an allowance first. So ERC 1155 and 721 tokens also have this exact same callback functionality. So in the updated forwarder, we'll be able to add sell support for all these different token standards without requiring user allowances, which is super nice. So this is, obviously much better UX. It's also probably overall better security because you do not need to set allowances. So you're not vulnerable to any bugs or anything like that. I also just want to call out, I believe that multi-collateral DAI is going to be a 777 token. And as far as I know, Augur version 2 is debating between using 777 and 1155. So all these different tokens, should be able to be sold with this pattern. Any questions on this? Cool. So one of the things that came up when re-auditing our 2.1 contracts were how many of these functions are actually being used, and should we think about simplifying the exchange contract interface? So by doing so, we can reduce the attack surface, but we could also just kind of reduce the cognitive overhead of using the smart contracts. I think sometimes there's a bit of a decision overload. So one of the functions that we identified as, a potential area for simplification are the market buy and market sell functions. So there are two different variations right now. One variation, they have the no throw suffix, and these functions will never fail essentially. So if they attempt to fill an order and that fill fails, it'll just kind of skip over it and keep filling the next order. But the standard versions of these, if any of the orders fail for any reason, then the entire transaction will fail. So in my opinion, I feel like most people should be using the no-throw versions of these functions. It just seems pretty risky to use the regular versions. However, we looked at some of the data, and the usage indicates that the standard versions are by far more commonly used. So I'm curious to get people's thoughts on replacing the standard versions completely with the no-throw versions. So we would just not even have the no-throw suffix. That would just be the default behavior of these functions. I suspect that the reason people are using the standard version currently might be because they don't understand the reasons where you might use the no-throw version. So yeah, curious to get people's thoughts on this, if anyone has any strong opinions.
This is Andrew at etherblockchain.io. We explicitly use the ones that throw for that purpose, to know that they all go through. And so aware of the no throws, but for us and some of the things that we're doing, if it were to actually partially fill the list of orders, then it would kind of cause issues for us.
Interesting.
Yeah, that kind of, I guess, changes the UX a bit. Like you're performing the market buy orders no throw under the hood without necessarily realizing it. You see a successful transaction, but the end result could be no tokens were traded at all.
Right, and then so it's hard to predetermine how much that user is going to end up with. So you're right, the UI. We're doing some other things as well that rely on that though too. So
I see. So another thing that occurred to me is that all of the other functions have like a filler kill equivalent. So you can specify how much needed to be filled. The market functions do not have a filler kill equivalent. So what I was kind of thinking was that maybe the default behavior is just no throw, but then maybe we add filler kill equivalents to those as well. So they would still not throw in the middle of the execution, but it would check at the end that the entire amounts were filled. Would off the top of your head, would that solve your issue?
off the top of my head, I guess I can't have I'm just not wrapped around it at this moment. I guess I kind of go back to what's the motivation for simplifying it. And I guess I could understand for auditability for you guys or whatever, but it's pretty nice to have all those options in the exchange contract.
How does everyone else feel about?
I think the answer is, I'm using this to buy X amount of tokens, and if it works, the transaction is successful. At the end of the day, I should have X amount of tokens. Whether it throws mid settlement or at the end of settlement, I don't think, from my perspective, really matters that much. But having a on-chain transaction that does throw if X amount of tokens weren't purchased sounds optimal from my perspective.
How do other people feel about the exchange contract interface? Like, are there too many functions? Does it not really matter? Do you have a good understanding of what all the functions do? Curious if anyone has any feedback on that at all.
I guess from where I sit at Open Relay, we know the ones that we use, and the fact that there are more is not particularly a problem for us.
Okay, well, the feedback I'm hearing right now is like we should probably just leave it the same. That's probably fine, which I think I'm okay with for sure. Maybe we should just like create a ZEIP and discuss this there. All right, let's move on to the next slide. Jacob, do you want to cover Asset Swapper?
Sure do, yeah. So we have recently released a new package called 0x Asset Swapper. If you've been using Asset Buyer, it behaves quite similarly. So Asset Buyer is the underlying package that powers the 0x Instant widget. So previously, Asset Buyer just fills via the forwarder and can only really use WETH or kind of uses ETH to power the WETH-based trading. Now Asset Swapper has the same functionality, but it also allows you to do ERC20 to ERC20 token trading as well. And it basically figures out, okay, given the taker, what balances and allowances they have, and decides whether it should use the forwarder or go to the exchange contract directly. So no one really has to worry about flipping to the forwarder or exchange anymore. They can just use Asset Swapper and it'll figure it out. It also allows the exporting of the order information and like the ABI encoded transaction. So you can take that ABI encoded transaction and give it to a contract, and that contract can just call that exchange and actually end up with the token. So it's useful for both consumer usages with the forwarder or exchange, but also useful for contract fillable liquidity. So if you have a contract that needs to fill some orders, you can use Asset Swapper to encode that data and just call it on chain. So we also have released a wiki page for contract fillable liquidity. So check that out. And if you have any questions, just come and ask me in Discord.
Cool. Thank you, Jacob.
And we also have some upcoming updates for LaunchKit. It's currently being beta tested by a few lovely users. Big things in LaunchKit is where it's got mesh support. So there's order discovery and order sharing, and the order validation is much, much faster. Now has full WebSocket SRA support, which is a long time coming. Under the hood, it also uses asset swapper, so it can flip between forwarder and the exchange contract. And all the SRA endpoints and the WebSocket SRA now include metadata. So that metadata includes the order hash as well as the remaining fillable taker asset amounts. And if you want to follow along, the PR for this is down the bottom there. And if you want to beta test it, then come reach out to me, and that'd be awesome if we get some more people using it.
We actually have a question. When is the projected LaunchKit deployment?
So I think it's it's all ready to go, and I think yeah, pretty much anyone can take it and deploy their own custom instance of it. Yeah.
So you can use it today. We're using it internally today as well. But it's also using Mesh, which is also in its beta period as well. So we're working out any kinks or any bugs with Mesh before fully releasing them together. So you could expect it to fully land roughly September with Mesh 1.0, but it's basically usable today.
Cool. So also wanted to talk about some new validation rules we're thinking about for validating orders in like Mesh and LaunchKit. So we ran into this issue where some orders may be partially fillable because the maker does not have a full balance or allowance to cover the entire order. And this becomes problematic if you're doing a market sell or a market buy, where you would think that it would just fill the amount that it could fill, but the way the smart contracts work, it's actually very difficult to do this, and it'll essentially just skip over that entire order. It also adds a lot of complexity to track these things in our tooling in general. So we decided it would be easier if we just treat non-fully backed orders as invalid. Curious to get people's thoughts on that, because it's a potentially big decision, but it would, I think, encourage good behavior by market makers, and it would really simplify a lot of the code in our code base. It's also, I don't think it's possible to fully deal with this case within the smart contracts themselves. So that's another reason for taking this approach.
So at Open Relay, we've always dropped orders from our order book if they weren't fully fillable. I would say one potential risk to this approach is that orders can be temporarily not fully fillable and then become fully fillable again. We write that off as once we've removed it from our order book, we're not putting it back. But that does potentially mean that we have orders that were on our order book that were dropped because they weren't fillable, but are fillable again. And it's not necessarily going to be easy for a maker or someone to go find that order that got dropped from our order book that they may have forgotten about or whatever.
Yeah, certainly one of the downsides. I don't know if there's a great way of dealing with that, but I do wonder if just by having this rule, if people would forget about that less and kind of just have more fully backed orders in general. But
So
yeah,
is Alex
it's
on
interesting
this
to hear that you've already been doing that.
I believe Mesh will keep these orders around for some time, and it will detect that this order is now fillable again, and then alert you to the fact that it is now fillable, but it will not keep them around forever. I do believe that's the case.
So that's true in general for cases that are invalid. I'll have to double check about this specific case. I think you're probably right. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, speaking of Mesh, just wanted to give a brief update about what's been going on. We've been running the beta for the past couple weeks. Thank you for everybody that is running a node and kind of testing out Mesh, reporting issues and talking about your experience. It's been really helpful so far. We just have a snapshot here of the last 24 hours of activity. On average, there's between 500 and 1,000 orders in Mesh at a time. We had about 15 active peers over the past 24 hours and nearly 100,000 orders shared. In grand total, we've probably had something like 50 or 60 peers participate in the beta. A lot of people are just spinning it up for a little bit and then tearing it down shortly afterwards. We've fixed a lot of bugs since the beta release, and we've been working on improving stability and adding new features. We're still planning to launch the 1.0 full release in September. And some of the things we're focusing on are custom topics and custom order validation, so that you'll be able to specify unique order formats for specific niche use cases and tell Mesh how to validate those orders. We're working on browser support, and you can track our progress towards browser support in GitHub. It's been going really well so far. And we're also working on some strategies to mitigate types of attacks that people could perform to try and take the network down, and also improve the incentives for sharing orders and behaving nicely within the system. Was there one more Mesh slide? Oh, no. Okay. Last thing, just if you have any questions or if you're interested in participating in the beta, come find us on Discord. We have a Mesh channel there, and we're happy to talk.
Also have a bunch of new content on YouTube. So we have this really cool explainer video for 0x. This is definitely targeting non-technical audiences. So yeah, hopefully you all enjoy that and share it with your friends. Alex also has a new video explaining 0x Mesh. And then we also have some new explainers for the ERC 1155 and static call proxy. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already.
Has everyone met Theo?
Not yet, I think.
Not yet? Oh, okay. Sorry, Theo. Yeah, Theo recently joined the team. He's a product manager for the protocol team, which is working directly on the smart contracts. And yeah, Theo has been helping us put more structure around our roadmap, and I'm sure he's going to be working more closely with other folks in the ecosystem to better understand your needs and make sure that we're working on the things that are most important to you. So yeah, here's Theo, and Theo's a great guy.
Thanks. Well, looking forward to working with you guys. I'm really impressed by the things that you're building, and yeah, I'll reach out soon to a few of you.
Awesome.
So, yeah, we have some time for if there are any questions, general topics or anything. Oh, it looks like we already have.
Yeah, so these are some of the questions that were submitted in our survey, but happy to answer anything else after. So for ZEIP 31, what is the projected voting period? I think that will most likely be 1 week, along, going along with all the other votes that have happened so far. If anyone has strong opinions on a time for that, yeah, would be happy to take that into consideration. What is the projected implementation timeline? So yeah, we already kind of covered the general V3 timeline, but it'll be fully implemented before the vote happens. And then if approved, it would have to undergo a 2-week time lock before being put into place. And then the Exchange 2.1 contract would also be live in parallel with the 3.0 contract. So it would give people time to transition over. And then I'm assuming at some point there would be a vote to essentially shut off the 2.1 contract. To better understand the staking contract for ZEIP 31, how exactly will market makers take advantage of the staked ZRX provided by users? So market makers will be able to specify a percentage of their total rebates that they're willing to share with delegators. And then, they can offer better rates or compete with other market makers or whatever. And delegators will choose to delegate to those market makers depending on the amount they're sharing, as well as things like past performance. So ultimately, what matters from a delegator's perspective is how many rebates are being collected by this market maker, what percentage of rewards are they sharing, and how many other people are already backing this market maker.
Yeah, another important detail too is that a key part of this design is that we want market makers to have significant voting power. So the idea is that when people delegate their staked ZRX to a market maker, they're also giving up 50% of their voting power to that market maker for the tokens. So this allows market makers to basically have an amplified voice in the governance system. But the people that are delegating their ZRX can still cancel out a market maker's vote if they want to by splitting the vote power 50-50 between market maker and delegator.
As market makers can also lose money market making, is that loss also shared among stake users with that market maker? No. So as a delegator, you are not sharing in the market maker's profit or losses from their actual market making activities. You are only sharing in part of their rebates that they are collecting. So the rebates can't actually go negative. Therefore, a delegator cannot lose money. However, you are essentially betting on that market maker's future performance. And if they decided they're just going to stop entirely and they didn't collect any rebates, then you would basically lose the opportunity cost of having your ZRX locked up for an epoch would probably be 2 weeks. Other questions with the successful implementation of ZRX Mesh. If I want to pull Radar Relay's orders onto my small unknown relayer, do I need approval from Radar Relay? Not really. Radar Relay already has an API you can interact with, and I'm sure someone will probably just be pulling orders from all the relayers APIs and dumping them into Mesh. So for the most part, I doubt there will be much overhead in doing that.
Just to add to that, one of the reasons that we built Mesh and one of the main appeals is that you do not need to know the identities of anybody else in the network ahead of time. There's automated peer discovery, so you'll automatically find people to pull orders from and to share orders with.
Will the ZeroX team be attending DevCon? Yes, I think it'll be somewhere between 5 and 10 of us at DevCon. Is anyone else planning on attending here? You don't need to say if you don't want to, I guess. But yeah, it'd be great to see a lot of you there.
Nice, Joshua's going.
Yeah, last year we also had like a relayer roundtable. I think we have quite a few more stakeholders in the ecosystem this year, so hopefully we can get some 0x events together while we're there. Are any other relayers considering implementation of the coordinator besides Bamboo Relay? I would say yes. I don't want to call out specific names. I'm not sure if people have talked about it publicly, but I can redirect this to the audience if anyone else is thinking about it.
Yeah, I think like once there's data to show the impact that the coordinator has on slippage and stuff, that I imagine like that'll be pretty compelling for most people that are looking at running relayers.
Yeah. Yeah, the data we've seen on Bamboo has been very, very promising so far. And yeah, market makers seem to like it. I think they're doing something like, what was it, 30,000 cancellations a day, which if you did on, through on-chain transactions would be very, very expensive. Also seems like, yeah, a lot of pairs on Bamboo actually have fairly good liquidity.
I think there are more questions in the chat.
Yeah. Oh, were there? Okay. I will stop sharing my screen and we can just answer the questions. Whoops. Has it been decided if 3.0 will support Order Watcher or will it only be Mesh? Our current thinking is to deprecate Order Watcher in favor of Mesh. I think there was a lot of overlap, but Mesh kind of just did a better job at pretty much everything, and it didn't make sense for us to be supporting both tools at once. You know, they're written in different languages, so it actually has a fair amount of overhead to support both.
Just to add to that, right now you can run Mesh with basically the networking disabled. So if you just want to do order validation, you can do that. If there is a lot of push for people using Mesh this way, we can also take steps to make that potentially easier and reduce the overhead even more.
Is there a better synopsis of 0x.js release change than the changelog file within the package? Probably not, although I know we are actually updating the format of our changelogs with some better categorizations. So I think it'll have like, you know, a list of breaking changes and non-breaking changes and stuff like that. I don't know, Jacob, do you?
Yeah, I guess like the way we kind of release packages is more of a trickle than I guess a big build up and then one big release. So those changelogs are always kind of going to appear to be a bit inconsistent with, I guess, the prior release because there's just going to be trickled changes. Andrew, what sort of things are you looking for that I guess could help out?
Well, I'm specifically looking at what impact it's going to have to our apps. You know, and while I know like most often it's a patch release, and typically we're not concerned, I still need to explain to other people what changes are in there. You know, and when I just see dependencies updated, it's, you know, then I have to go digging to see exactly what packages had changed. So even like a list of these are the packages that changed in this release would be super helpful.
Got it. Yeah, a lot of the time dependency updated is pretty confusing, but we do adhere to semantic versioning. So everything that should come out in a patch release shouldn't be breaking. But I think we can look to basically, it's probably just figuring out the most important things that are going to change for everyday users, and I guess bubbling up that information.
Yeah,
You
I
said
mean, a good
that's
example
accurate.
is the latest contract releases, right? That had some impact for us, and maybe some assumptions on contract addresses and that sort of thing. So you get much more familiar with those other packages, and we didn't have to before necessarily, you know. So that was a little bit of an issue for us, just knowing what was buried in there. And then there were subsequent releases, like I think the .11, 12, 13, all had a little bit different addresses in there. So
Yes, that's true. So I guess, are you just basically using 0xJS, the top level package?
in some cases, yes. Some cases we export a few modules out of the 0x.js. But yes and no, I suppose. I mean, we're using quite a few things from you guys. So
Yeah, got it. I guess, probably one of the biggest problems is we'd update one of the underlying packages, but those changes don't really get reflected in 0xJS's changelog. You'll see that dependencies updated thing. So I think we can look to better ways to communicate some of these bigger things that are, breaking, which may be in the underlying packages, but not in 0xJS itself, because that package doesn't actually change that much anymore, apart from dependencies updated.
yeah, okay. Cool.
Yeah, if you know exactly which of the packages you're using within 0x.js, you could just install those individually, and then I think those change logs will be more granular, but you should also have kind of better control over which individual packages get upgraded rather than just upgrading the entire 0x.js.
Well,
because they're all individual NPM modules.
Yeah, no, I get that, but I mean, it sure is nice to know that I've grabbed a release of 0xJS 6.0.13 and they're all meant to work together. Then you try to figure that out, you know?
Yeah.
And if there was just a list of here's a module that changed in this patch release, that'd be super helpful.
Okay. Thank you for the feedback. Another question, who can we reach out to for help with the launch kit deployment, AWS environment setup in particular? So I would probably post a question in our Discord, and Jacob is monitoring that pretty frequently, and I think he'd be able to help.
I believe they already have, but I have not checked Discord yet, so I haven't got around to that. But we do have a couple of guides in the FAQ right now. One is for setting up HTTPS and traffic, which is also taking you through some AWS setup as well. But we can't necessarily write a guide for every cloud provider out there, so some of this has to be, I guess, investigated in your own time as well. But if you do have any questions, then we're happy to help out where we can.
Cool. Were there any other questions?
Not a question, but a comment. 0x Mesh is pretty awesome. Wish we had it a long time ago. It's been great.
Thanks. I mean, we're really excited about it too. Yeah.
Nice. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining, and we will see you next month.